The dust-laden wind whistled through the empty streets of Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, carrying with it the acrid smell of sage and the promise of approaching storm clouds. It was the kind of late afternoon when most folks sought shelter, yet the sounds of raucous laughter spilled from the Lucky Strike Saloon, cutting through the oppressive heat like a knife through butter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The laughter belonged to a stranger who'd ridden into town less than an hour ago. He sat at a corner table, his back to the wall, playing cards with 3 local ranch hands. His appearance was unremarkable. A trail-worn duster, a wide-brimmed black hat pulled low over his eyes, and boots that had seen better days. But there was something about his easy manner and constant chuckling that set teeth on edge, particularly those of Jake Hawley and his gang of cutthroats watching from the bar. "Ain't natural," Hawley muttered, his scarred face twisted in a scowl. "Man winning that much ought to be nervous, not sitting there laughing like he's at his mama's Sunday dinner." He took another pull from his whiskey bottle, dark eyes never leaving the stranger. The stranger's laughter rang out again as he raked in another pot, his shoulders shaking with genuine mirth. "Boys," he said, wiping tears from his eyes, "I haven't had this much fun since that time in Dodge City when—" He trailed off, still chuckling, leaving the story untold. What Hawley and his men couldn't know, what nobody in Bitter Creek knew, was that the laughing stranger was Jed "Lightning" McKenna, the most feared bounty hunter west of the Mississippi. His reputation had been built not just on his lightning-fast draw or his uncanny ability to track men across impossible terrain, but on the way he seemed to genuinely enjoy his work. Tales spoke of him laughing, even in the midst of gunfights, a sound that had become the last thing many wanted men ever heard. Sheriff Tom Riley, reading wanted posters in his office down the street, was just about to learn who had wandered into his town. A telegram from the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne lay on his desk. "Reliable information. Jed, McKenna tracking Hawley gang. Believed heading your way. Approach with caution. McKenna known to be unpredictable but effective." Back in the saloon, Hawley had finally had enough. He pushed away from the bar, flanked by his 2 most trusted men, Sidewinder Pete Collins and a massive former blacksmith known only as Bull. The trio approached the card table, their spurs ringing against the wooden floor. The other patrons quickly found reasons to move away, leaving a conspicuous empty space around the impending confrontation. The stranger looked up, still smiling, though something shifted in his eyes, a dangerous glimmer that the ranch hands across from him caught. They folded their cards and departed with mumbled excuses, leaving their money on the table. "Something amusing, friend?" Hawley asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had made his name feared across 3 territories. The stranger's smile widened. "Just about everything, truth be told. Life's a funny business, don't you think?" He gathered the cards, shuffling them with practiced ease. "Care to sit in?" "Game's more interesting with higher stakes." Hawley's hand drifted toward his gun. "Might be I'm more interested in how a man comes by so much luck at cards. Might be we need to have a discussion about that." "Luck?" The stranger's laughter bubbled up again, genuine and unsettling. "Partner, luck's got nothing to do with it. I just enjoy playing the game." His hands remained in plain sight on the table, but there was something in his relaxed posture that made even Bull shift uncomfortably. Thunder rumbled in the distance as storm clouds gathered over Bitter Creek, casting the saloon into premature twilight. In his office, Sheriff Riley grabbed his gun belt, the telegram crumpled in his other hand, and in the Lucky Strike, Jed McKenna prepared to play a very different kind of game, one that had made him legend throughout the West. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Lucky Strike Saloon had grown quiet enough to hear the bat-wing doors creak in the wind. Even the piano player had stopped, his hands hovering uncertainly over the keys as he watched the confrontation unfold. Outside, the first fat droplets of rain began to fall, drumming against the roof like nervous fingers. "Tell you what," McKenna said, still shuffling the cards with fluid grace. Since you boys seem interested in games, how about we raise the stakes? His eyes, previously hidden beneath his hat brim, lifted to meet Hawley's. They were startling blue, filled with both mirth and something harder, like steel beneath silk. Hawley's fingers twitched near his holster. "What kind of stakes you talking about, stranger?" McKenna's laugh rolled through the saloon again, but this time it carried an edge that made several onlookers step further back. "Well now, Jake Hawley," he saw the outlaw stiffen at the use of his name. "I reckon the Territorial Marshal's office has set some mighty interesting stakes. 2,500 for you, 800 each for Sidewinder and Bull there, and various amounts for the rest of your gang. By my count, that adds up to a pretty fair pot." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Bull's massive hands clenched into fists, while Sidewinder's face went pale beneath his weather-beaten tan. Hawley, however, showed no reaction beyond a slight narrowing of his eyes. "You've got sand, bounty hunter," Hawley said softly. "I'll give you that. Walking in here, sitting down bold as brass, knowing who we are." "Who said I just walked in?" McKenna replied, his smile never wavering. "Been tracking you boys since that mess in Rock Springs. Figured you'd head for Bitter Creek. It's the logical stop before the Montana border." He finally set the cards down, keeping his hands in plain sight. "You've led me on quite a chase, I'll admit. Been entertaining, though, most fun I've had in months." Sheriff Riley chose that moment to burst through the saloon doors, his gun already drawn. "Everyone stay calm," he shouted, then faltered as he took in the scene, particularly McKenna's relaxed posture and persistent grin. "Afternoon, Sheriff," McKenna called cheerfully. "Pull up a chair. Mr. Hawley and I were just discussing business opportunities." Hawley's gang had begun filtering into the saloon, drawn by word of the confrontation. McKenna counted them with quick glances, 4 by the back door, 3 more at the bar. With Hawley, Sidewinder, and Bull, that made 10. 10 of the most dangerous outlaws in the territory, all eyeing him with murderous intent. The thought seemed to delight him immensely. "Last chance, boys," McKenna said, still grinning. "We can do this the easy way. You all come along peaceful, have a nice quiet ride to Cheyenne. Or ... His chuckle took on a darker tone. "Well, the hard way is more entertaining, but it tends to be harder on the furniture, and these good folks," he nodded toward the saloon owner, "they've got a nice establishment here." Thunder crashed outside, and in that instant, Sidewinder went for his gun. What happened next would be debated in Bitter Creek for years to come. McKenna's hand moved so fast it seemed to disappear. His first shot took Sidewinder's gun arm. His second knocked Bull's weapon away before the big man could clear leather. His laughter never stopped, even as chaos erupted in the Lucky Strike Saloon. Sheriff Riley dove behind an overturned table as the room exploded in gunfire. Through the thunder of revolvers and the crash of breaking glass, he could hear McKenna's wild laughter, the sound that had become legend throughout the West, the laugh that made him more feared than any scowl or threat ever could. The Lucky Strike Saloon transformed into a storm of lead and splinters. McKenna moved like a man who'd rehearsed this dance 1,000 times, his actions smooth and precise despite the chaos surrounding him. His laughter mixed with the gunsmoke, creating an eerie soundtrack to the violence that made even hardened outlaws hesitate. "Come on, boys," he called out, ducking behind a thick wooden post as bullets chewed the bar behind him. Surely the famous Hawley gang can shoot better than that. His return fire was methodical, each shot finding its mark. A gun hand here, a shoulder there, never killing but making it impossible for his targets to fight effectively. Hawley had taken cover behind an overturned table, his face twisted with rage as he watched his carefully built gang being dismantled by a laughing madman. "Bull!" he shouted over the din. "Get around behind him!" The massive former blacksmith tried to move through the chaos, but McKenna's voice rang out again. Bull! Dance with the partner you brought." A shot rang out, and Bull's hat went spinning, followed by another that splintered the floorboard at his feet. The big man froze, caught in the open, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Sheriff Riley, still behind his makeshift cover, watched in amazement. He'd heard stories about McKenna's skill, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The bounty hunter wasn't just fighting, he was controlling the entire room, herding his targets like a skilled sheepdog working a flock. "You know what's truly funny?" McKenna called out, his voice carrying over the gunfire. "Every gang I hunt makes the same mistakes. They think numbers make them strong. They think fear makes them powerful." He punctuated each statement with a shot, methodically disarming another of Hawley's men. "But you want to know the real joke?" Thunder crashed outside as the storm reached its peak, and in that moment, McKenna burst from cover, moving with inhuman speed. 2 more outlaws went down, clutching wounded arms or legs, their guns skittering across the floor. His revolution brought him face to face with Bull, who stood frozen in disbelief. "The real joke," McKenna said softly, though everyone in the room could hear him, "is that none of you ever stop to ask why I'm laughing." Bull, despite his size and fearsome reputation, found himself unable to move as he stared into those amused blue eyes. The bounty hunter's gun was pointed casually at his chest, but his other hand was free, gesturing as if he were simply having a friendly conversation. "Want to know why I laugh, Bull?" McKenna's voice had taken on an almost gentle tone. "Because every single time, men like you and Hawley think you're different. Think you'll be the ones to beat me. And that, my large friend, is hilarious." The massive outlaw slowly raised his hands in surrender, his face ashen. Behind them, Hawley snarled and rose from cover, his gun aimed at McKenna's back. "Let's see if you laugh with a bullet in your spine, you son of a—" But McKenna was already moving, spinning Bull around to use as cover while drawing his second gun in a motion too fast to follow. His laughter rang out again as Hawley's bullet whizzed past, and the remaining outlaws found themselves caught in a crossfire between the bounty hunter and Sheriff Riley, who had finally seen an opening to contribute. "Time to fold this hand, Jake," McKenna called out, his voice full of genuine amusement. "Though I've got to thank you. Haven't had this much entertainment since that dust-up in Dodge City." The rain hammered against the roof, providing a drumbeat to his words, as he steadily reduced the outlaws' options for escape or resistance. Hawley's remaining men were running out of options and ammunition. 3 were already down with various wounds. 2 more had thrown their guns aside in surrender, and Bull stood frozen, still being used as McKenna's impromptu shield. The storm outside had reached its full fury, rain hammering against the windows while lightning illuminated the chaos within. "You know what the trouble is with men like you, Jake?" McKenna called out, his voice carrying that same unsettling mirth. "You build these gangs, make these big plans, but you never consider the simplest things." He fired again, catching one of the last gunmen in the shoulder. Like how a man who laughs at death might just be more dangerous than one who deals it cold. Sheriff Riley had managed to work his way around the edge of the room, his own gun adding to the pressure on the remaining outlaws. He'd never seen anything like this, a gunfight being conducted like a conversation, with McKenna seeming to treat the whole thing as some elaborate joke. "Starting to see the humor yet, boys?" McKenna chuckled, moving smoothly behind an overturned table while keeping Bull covered. "No? Well, let me explain the punchline. You're all so busy trying to be feared that you never learn to fear the right things, like a man who can track you across 3 territories just because he finds it amusing." Hawley, his face contorted with rage, had worked his way behind the bar. "You're dead, McKenna, you hear me? Dead!" He punctuated his words with wild shots that shattered bottles and sent liquor streaming across the floor. "Now that's just wasteful," McKenna sighed, though his voice still carried that edge of laughter. "Good whiskey's hard to come by out here." He fired twice more, his bullet splintering the bar inches from Hawley's position. "Tell you what, I'll make you the same offer I made in Rock Springs before you boys ran. Surrender now, ride to Cheyenne in one piece, maybe even get there in time for a hot meal." One of the remaining gunmen, a young outlaw barely out of his teens, suddenly threw down his weapon. "I'm done," he shouted, raising his hands. "Ain't worth dying over." "Smart boy," McKenna nodded, his eyes never leaving Hawley's position. "Anyone else feeling suddenly wise? No shame in it. Well, maybe a little shame, but that's better than a pine box, wouldn't you say?" Lightning flashed again, and in that brief illumination, McKenna caught sight of Sidewinder Pete trying to crawl toward a dropped gun. Without even seeming to look, he put a bullet in the floor beside the wounded man's hand. "Ah, come on, Pete," he laughed. "Haven't I ventilated you enough for one day? Though I must say you're providing excellent entertainment. Tell you what, you make another move for that gun and I'll see if I can part your hair from 30 feet. Wouldn't that be something to tell your grandchildren? Assuming you live to have any." The saloon had become eerily quiet except for the storm and McKenna's occasional chuckles. The outlaws who were still conscious were weighing their options, while those who'd surrendered sat with their backs against the wall, looking shell-shocked. Sheriff Riley kept his gun trained on the group, still trying to process how one laughing madman had managed to destroy the most feared gang in the territory. "Final offer, Jake," McKenna called out, his voice taking on an almost sing-song quality. "Because this storm's making me think about a warm jail cell and a hot cup of coffee. What do you say? Ready to appreciate the absurdity of your situation?" Thunder rolled across Bitter Creek as Hawley considered his options, each one worse than the last. The bar provided decent cover, but he was running low on ammunition, and McKenna's accuracy made any attempt to return fire practically suicidal. The bounty hunter's laughter had gotten under his skin, making it hard to think clearly. "Tick-tock, Jake," McKenna called out cheerfully. "Though I suppose I should thank you. You've made this much more entertaining than usual. Most gangs give up after I shoot the first 3 or 4 members. You've got real determination, I'll give you that." Bull, still standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, cleared his throat. "Boss," he called out, his deep voice unusually timid, "maybe we ought to listen to him. Ain't never seen shooting like this." "Shut up, Bull," Hawley snarled. But the big man's words had an effect on the remaining outlaws. They'd all heard stories about Lightning McKenna, but seeing him in action was something else entirely. The way he treated a life-or-death gunfight like some kind of amusing parlor game was more terrifying than any cold-blooded killer they'd ever encountered. McKenna's voice took on a thoughtful tone. "You know what's really funny, Sheriff? Every time I track down a gang like this, I learn something new about human nature. Take our friend Jake here. Successful outlaw, feared across 3 territories, but he never figured out the most important rule of survival out here." "What's that?" Riley asked, genuinely curious despite the tension of the moment. "The most dangerous man in a gunfight isn't the one who's angry, or scared, or even the fastest draw," McKenna replied, his words punctuated by another crash of thunder. "It's the one who's genuinely enjoying himself, because that man's got nothing to lose and everything to gain, even if it's just a good story to tell later." As if to demonstrate his point, McKenna suddenly rolled from behind his cover, firing 3 shots in rapid succession. The first knocked Hawley's hat off, the second shattered the bottle he was reaching for, and the third splintered the floor between his feet. The outlaw leader yelped and ducked lower, his face flushing red with rage and embarrassment. "See what I mean?" McKenna laughed. "That was fun. Want to try it again? I've got this theory about how many shots it takes to make a man dance involuntarily. So far my record is 6, but you look pretty light on your feet, Jake." The saloon owner, who had been watching the entire scene from behind his reinforced cashier's cage, finally spoke up. "Mister, you are absolutely crazy." "Crazy?" McKenna's grin widened. No, my friend. Crazy would be doing this for free. I'm getting paid quite well, which makes me eccentric. There's a world of difference." The storm outside was beginning to slacken, the thunder growing more distant. In the relative quiet, they could hear horses approaching, reinforcements from the sheriff's office finally responding to the gunfire. Hawley knew his window of opportunity was closing fast. "Last chance, Jake," McKenna called out. "I'm starting to run out of jokes, and believe me, that's when things get really dangerous. Ask the Clayton brothers about that. Well, you would if any of them could still talk properly." The remaining outlaws exchanged nervous glances. They'd heard about what happened to the Clayton gang, how McKenna had tracked them for 2 weeks, picking them off one by one, always with that same unsettling laugh. The story went that the last Clayton had given himself up just to escape the sound of that laughter echoing through the canyons at night. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder as Deputy Marshal Wilson and his men surrounded the Lucky Strike. Hawley could hear them taking up positions outside, cutting off any chance of escape. The rain had settled into a gentle patter, no longer masking the sounds of movement around the building. "Hear that, Jake?" McKenna's voice carried across the saloon, still rich with amusement. "Seems like the whole territory's turning out for our little party. I'm flattered, really. Though I was hoping to wrap this up before involving the good marshal. He tends to be a bit formal about these things." Hawley's mind raced, searching for options. He'd built his reputation on being unpredictable, dangerous, but McKenna had turned the tables, making him feel like a trapped rat. The bounty hunter's constant laughter was like a file scraping across his nerves, making it impossible to focus. "You know what the real irony is?" McKenna continued, as if they were having a friendly conversation over drinks. "I wasn't even looking for you boys originally. Was tracking that bank robber McClintock up near Casper. But then I heard about your little escapade in Rock Springs and, well..." He chuckled. "It just sounded like so much more fun," a voice called in from outside. Marshal Wilson, his words carrying official weight. "This is the U.S. Marshal's office. The building is surrounded. Throw out your weapons and come out with your hands up." "See?" McKenna sighed theatrically. "Formal. No appreciation for the art of the moment. Though I suppose we should wrap this up. I promised the marshal's wife I'd join them for Sunday dinner, and she makes a spectacular apple pie." Bull, still standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, shifted his weight. "Boss, they got us dead to rights. Even if you somehow get past McKenna, there's no getting through those marshals." Hawley knew Bull was right, but pride and rage had him in their grip. He'd spent years building his reputation, becoming a name that made men tremble. Now he was being dismantled by a man who treated it all like some grand joke. "Tell you what," McKenna offered, his tone suddenly businesslike, though still tinged with mirth. "I'll make it sporting. You come out now, I'll let you keep your dignity. Won't tell anyone how you were hiding behind that bar. Won't mention how your shots went wild. I'll even write up in my report that you put up a proper fight." A few of the conscious outlaws perked up at this. They knew reputation was currency in their world, and McKenna was offering to let them save face. It was a surprisingly generous offer from a man who had them completely at his mercy. "Of course," the bounty hunter added cheerfully. "If you prefer, we can do this the entertaining way. I've got plenty of ammunition left, and I've been working on this new trick shot I've been dying to try out. Involves ricochets, a bit of geometry, and possibly some minor property damage." The saloon owner groaned. "Please, surrender," he called to Hawley. "I don't think my insurance covers trick shots by laughing bounty hunters." Outside, Marshal Wilson was losing patience. "You have 1 minute to respond, or we're coming in. And I should mention that Lightning McKenna has full authority to handle this situation as he sees fit." "Hear that, Jake?" McKenna's grin was audible in his voice. "I've got official sanction to be creative. Now, about that trick shot, I was thinking maybe if I bounce a bullet off that fancy mirror behind the bar, then hit that brass spittoon just right." Jake Hawley's world had shrunk to the space behind the bar, the wood-paneled sanctuary that now felt more like a coffin. The liquid courage from broken bottles soaked into his clothes, mixing with cold sweat. Every time McKenna's laughter rang out, he felt his grip on his gun tighten, but his hands were trembling now. "Time's almost up, Jake," McKenna called out cheerfully. "Though I must say this has been delightful. You know, most men I hunt, they try to be so serious about everything. All scowls and threats, and you'll never take me alive. But you've given me a whole afternoon of entertainment." Through the windows, Hawley could see the sun beginning to break through the storm clouds, casting long shadows across the saloon floor. Marshal Wilson's men had positioned themselves at every possible exit, their shadows visible through the rain-streaked glass. "Boss," Bull ventured again, still standing awkwardly where McKenna had positioned him. "I got family, can't die here, not like this." Before Hawley could respond, McKenna's voice cut in, gentle but firm. "Go on, Bull. You've shown more sense than most. Marshal Wilson will treat you fair." The big man needed no further encouragement, moving carefully toward the door with his hands raised. "You see that, Jake?" McKenna continued. "Even your most loyal man knows when the game is up. Though I suppose loyalty might not be the right word. Tell me, did you ever share the take fairly with your men?" "No, don't answer that. The way they're all surrendering suggests you didn't." Sheriff Riley, who had maintained his position covering the room, couldn't help but marvel at McKenna's strategy. The bounty hunter wasn't just disarming Hawley's men physically, he was dismantling the very foundations of their loyalty, all while making it seem like casual conversation. "You know what the funniest thing is?" McKenna mused as if sharing a private joke. "I've got a theory that most outlaws turn bad because they take themselves too seriously, get all wrapped up in their reputation, their image, forget how to laugh at themselves. Take you, for instance. When's the last time you just sat back and appreciated the absurdity of life?" A shot rang out suddenly, Hawley firing blindly over the bar in frustration. The bullet went wide, shattering a lamp and sending glass tinkling to the floor. "Now that's just poor sportsmanship," McKenna chided, his laughter rolling through the room. "And terrible aim, by the way. Though I suppose that's understandable given your current state of mind. Here, let me show you how it's done properly." 2 shots rang out in quick succession. The first bullet struck the mirror behind the bar at a precise angle, sending fragments of glass cascading down. The second caught one of those fragments mid-fall, creating a spectacular spray of glittering shards that rained down around Hawley's position. "Been practicing that one for months," McKenna said proudly. "Never quite had the right setup to try it before. What did you think? Too theatrical? I worry sometimes about overdoing it, but then I think, why not enjoy your work?" Outside, Marshal Wilson's voice called out again. 30 seconds, Hawley. Make your decision." "Tick-tock," McKenna sing-songed. "Though I should warn you, if you make me come get you, I'll have to tell everyone about how you've been cowering behind that bar. And I do mean everyone. I can be quite descriptive when I write my reports. Might even throw in some colorful metaphors about scared rabbits and such." The Lucky Strike had become preternaturally quiet in the wake of McKenna's spectacular shooting display. Even the surrendered outlaws were staring at the glittering remains of the mirror with a mixture of awe and terror. The demonstration had made it abundantly clear that the bounty hunter could have ended this hours ago if he'd wanted to. "You know, Jake," McKenna mused, casually reloading his pistol, "I've been thinking about what makes a proper legend out here in the territories. Take yourself, for instance. You built yours on fear, on being the meanest snake in the garden. But fear's a funny thing." He paused to chuckle. It has a way of turning back on itself. Hawley remained silent behind the bar, but his breathing had become ragged, audible in the tense quiet. McKenna's words were cutting deeper than any bullet could. "Now me," the bounty hunter continued. "I built my reputation on laughter. Seems contradictory, doesn't it? A man who laughs while hunting dangerous men, but that's exactly why it works. Because nothing terrifies a serious man more than someone who can laugh in the face of death." Marshal Wilson's voice carried through the window again. 15 seconds, Hawley." Although, McKenna added thoughtfully, "I suppose I should mention that my reputation isn't entirely based on laughter. There's also the small matter of never having failed to bring in a bounty. Dead or alive, though I do prefer alive. Dead men tell no tales, and I do so enjoy a good story." Sheriff Riley had been watching the psychological dismantling of Jake Hawley with professional interest. He'd dealt with his share of outlaws over the years, but he'd never seen anyone break down a hardened criminal quite like this. "Tell you what," McKenna offered, his voice taking on an almost conspiratorial tone. "I'll sweeten the deal. Surrender now and I'll let you in on the secret, the real reason I laugh. The truth behind the legend of Lightning McKenna. Might give you something interesting to think about during those long nights in prison." A soft thud came from behind the bar, Hawley's gun hitting the floor. The outlaw's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "You're insane." McKenna's laughter rang out again, genuine and warm. "No, my friend. I'm just the only sane man in a world gone mad. Now, why don't you stand up nice and slow? Let's give Marshall Wilson out there the proper ending he's expecting." Hawley rose slowly from behind the bar, his hands trembling as he raised them. His face was a mask of defeat, all the legendary ferocity drained away. The man who had terrorized 3 territories had been reduced to a shell by nothing more than laughter and words. "That's it," McKenna encouraged, as if talking to a nervous horse. "See? Isn't this better than all that shooting and posturing? Though I must say, you've been a wonderful audience. Some bounties just go through the motions, but you really committed to your role." Marshal Wilson and his deputies began filing into the saloon, taking custody of the various outlaws. The lawmen moved with practiced efficiency, but they gave McKenna a wide berth, eyeing him with a mixture of respect and unease. "Oh, and Jake," McKenna called out as the marshals began shackling the gang leader. "About that secret I promised you. Why, I really laugh." He holstered his gun with a flourish. "The truth is, I just genuinely enjoy my work." As Marshal Wilson's deputies led the last of Hawley's men out of the Lucky Strike, the atmosphere in the saloon began to shift. The tension that had held the room in its grip for hours finally started to dissolve, replaced by a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Outside, curious townspeople were emerging from their shelters, drawn by the sight of the infamous Hawley gang being led away in chains. "You know," McKenna said, settling onto a bar stool and brushing glass fragments from his duster, "this really has been one of my more enjoyable afternoons. Wouldn't you agree, Sheriff?" Riley holstered his gun, shaking his head in amazement. "I've been wearing this badge for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. You didn't just beat them, you broke them." McKenna's eyes twinkled with mirth. "Breaking is such a harsh word. I prefer to think of it as helping them discover their hidden sense of humor." He turned to the shell-shocked saloon owner. "Speaking of which, my good man, I believe I owe you for several broken bottles and that rather expensive mirror, plus a generous tip for the entertainment value." The barkeep waved him off. "After what you just did? Way I see it, the town owes you. That mirror's been crooked for years anyway." Marshal Wilson approached, his weathered face bearing a grudging respect. 7 months we've been chasing Hawley. 7 months of robberies, killings, and terror. Then you walk in and take him down in an afternoon, while laughing about it. Well, McKenna grinned, I had a distinct advantage over you lawmen. He paused for effect. "I wasn't trying to be serious about it." The marshal snorted. "That's one way to put it. Though I have to ask, that trick shot with the mirror, was that really necessary?" "Necessary? No." McKenna chuckled. "But it was spectacular, wasn't it? And in my line of work, sometimes the spectacle is just as important as the capture. Stories will spread about how Hawley was taken down, and the next outlaw might think twice before causing trouble." Sheriff Riley pulled up a chair, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Is that why you do it? The laughing, the jokes, the theatrics? It's all just to build the legend?" McKenna's smile took on a more thoughtful quality. "Part of it, sure. But there's more to it than that. You see, I've noticed something about the men I hunt. They all share one common trait. They've forgotten how to see the humor in life. They get so caught up in being dangerous, in being feared, that they lose perspective." He stood, walking over to where Hawley had made his last stand. "Take our friend Jake here. He spent years building this image of himself as some kind of territorial terror. But in the end, what brought him down wasn't faster guns or better tactics. It was the simple fact that he couldn't handle someone laughing at his carefully constructed persona." Deputy Wilson, who had returned from securing the prisoners, joined the conversation. "But aren't you worried that someone might not take you seriously? That they might think you're not a real threat?" McKenna's laugh echoed through the saloon once more. "Young man, that's exactly what I want them to think. Because by the time they realize their mistake, it's already too late." The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows through the broken windows of the Lucky Strike. As the town's carpenter arrived to assess the damage, McKenna sat at a corner table counting out bills from a thick wallet. "For the repairs," he explained to the astonished saloon owner, laying out far more money than the damage warranted. "And a little extra for the story rights. Trust me, you'll make it all back and more once word spreads about what happened here today. Nothing draws customers like a good tale." Marshal Wilson, who had returned from securing the prisoners in the jail, settled into a chair across from the bounty hunter. "Speaking of tales, McKenna, there's something that's been bothering me. That business in Dodge City you kept mentioning to Hawley, that never happened, did it?" McKenna's eyes sparkled with amusement. "Smart man, Marshal. No, it didn't. But Hawley didn't know that, did he? He spent half the fight wondering what happened in Dodge, trying to figure out what I was referring to. Kept him off balance, made him second-guess himself." "And the Clayton brothers?" Sheriff Riley asked. "The story about hunting them through the canyons?" "Oh, that one's true enough," McKenna chuckled. "Though I may have embellished the part about the last brother surrendering just to escape my laughter. Actually, he slipped on some wet rocks and knocked himself cold. But my version makes a better story, don't you think?" The lawman exchanged glances, beginning to understand the depth of McKenna's methodology. He wasn't just a skilled gunfighter or clever tracker. He was a master of manipulation, using stories and reputation as weapons just as deadly as his pistols. But why go to all that trouble? Deputy Wilson wondered aloud. Why not just go in shooting? You clearly have the skill. McKenna's face grew serious for a moment, though his eyes retained their ever-present glimmer of amusement. Because, young man, dead bodies don't learn lessons. Every man I bring in alive is a story that spreads, a warning to others. Hawley will spend years in prison, and every time someone asks him about today, he'll have to tell them how he was outsmarted by a laughing madman. And that's better than killing him, the deputy pressed. Much better, McKenna nodded. Death makes martyrs. Humiliation makes examples. A month from now, some up-and-coming outlaw will visit Hawley in prison, looking for advice about the territories. And Jake, his pride still stinging, will tell him about the man who laughs. He'll warn him that there are worse things than dying in a gunfight. The saloon owner, who had been listening intently, brought over a fresh bottle of whiskey. "On the house," he insisted. "Though I have to ask, what if Hawley hadn't broken? What if he'd forced you to kill him?" "Then we'd be telling a different story," McKenna replied, his smile returning. "One about a fool who was so serious about being dangerous that he died rather than learn to laugh at himself. But that story wouldn't have been nearly as interesting, would it?" As he poured drinks for the assembled men, McKenna's gaze drifted to the street outside, where townsfolk were already gathering in small groups, sharing their versions of what they'd heard and seen. The legend was growing with each retelling, exactly as he'd intended. As evening approached, bringing with it the promise of a spectacular sunset after the storm, McKenna found himself entertaining an impromptu audience at the Lucky Strike. Word had spread through Bitter Creek like wildfire, drawing curious townsfolk eager to see the legendary bounty hunter for themselves. "You should have seen Hawley's face," the saloon owner was telling anyone who'd listen, "when McKenna did that trick shot with the mirror. Never seen anything like it in all my years behind this bar." McKenna sat back, sipping his whiskey and letting the stories flow around him. Each retelling grew slightly more elaborate, which seemed to amuse him greatly. He knew that by morning, the tale would have spread to neighboring towns, growing with each iteration. "Tell us about your other captures," someone called out. "Is it true what they say about the Sutton gang up in Montana?" The bounty hunter's eyes twinkled. "Now that's an interesting story. Though I should warn you, the part about the trained bear is completely true, despite what the newspapers claimed." His laughter rang out as he saw their shocked expressions. "But that's a tale for another time. Right now, I'm more interested in hearing your versions of today's events." Marshal Wilson, who had stayed to help organize the prisoner transfer, leaned in closer. "Speaking of today's events, there's something I've been wondering. That moment when Sidewinder went for his gun, you had to have known he would try it. You were watching him the whole time." "Of course I knew," McKenna nodded, his smile knowing. "Men like Sidewinder are predictable. They can't stand being laughed at. I could have stopped him before he even touched his gun, but then we wouldn't have had our afternoon's entertainment." "You let him draw?" Deputy Wilson asked incredulously. "Just for the show of it?" "Everything's a show, young man. Everything's a story waiting to be told." McKenna gestured around the crowded saloon. "Look at these good people. They're not just here to see me, they're here to be part of the story. Tomorrow, they'll tell their friends about the night they shared drinks with Lightning McKenna after he took down the Hawley gang. Their friends will tell others, and the legend grows." Sheriff Riley, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "And that's what keeps other outlaws in line? The legend?" "Partly," McKenna replied. "But it's more than that. Every man who straps on a gun out here is trying to write his own legend. The trick is to make them realize that some legends are better left unchallenged." He paused, taking another sip of whiskey. "Take young Bull, for instance. Mark my words, when he gets out of prison, he'll go straight. Not because he's afraid of being shot, but because he's afraid of being laughed at again." The crowd hung on his every word, and McKenna played them like a virtuoso. He knew that every gesture, every chuckle, every casual revelation was being memorized and would be repeated in a dozen saloons across the territory. "The thing about legends," he continued, his voice carrying easily through the room, "is that they work both ways. The stories about me make outlaws nervous, make them second-guess themselves. But they also give good folks hope. They remind everyone that sometimes justice wears an unexpected face." A young boy, who had sneaked into the saloon despite his mother's protests, raised his hand. "Mr. McKenna, sir? Are you really as fast as they say?" McKenna's laugh filled the saloon once again, but this time it carried a gentler tone as he addressed the young boy. "Fast?" he mused, spinning an empty glass on the table. "Well, that depends on what stories you've heard. Some folks say I'm so quick I can shoot a man's gun out of his hand before he knows he's drawn it. Others claim I'm fast enough to put out a candle flame without disturbing the wick." The boy's eyes widened. "Can you really do that?" "Tell you what," McKenna said, his eyes twinkling. "Let's try something a bit safer." He pulled a silver dollar from his pocket. "See this coin? I'm going to flip it in the air, draw my gun, and put a hole through it before it hits the ground. What do you say to that?" The crowd pressed closer, eager to witness one of McKenna's legendary demonstrations. Even Marshal Wilson leaned forward with interest, having heard tales of the bounty hunter's speed, but never seeing it firsthand. "Now," McKenna continued, addressing the whole room, "the trick isn't just about being fast. It's about knowing when to be fast." He held up the coin, letting it catch the lamplight. "Like hunting outlaws, timing is everything. You have to read the moment, understand the rhythm." Without warning, he flipped the coin high into the air. The movement was so casual that some observers almost missed it. What happened next seemed to defy possibility. McKenna's draw was a blur, his shot cracking through the saloon before most eyes could even register his movement. The coin spun wildly before he snatched it from the air with his free hand. "Here you go, son," he said, handing the coin to the wide-eyed boy. Sure enough, there was a perfect hole drilled through its center. "Keep it. Consider it a reminder that there's more to being fast than just speed." The boy clutched the coin like it was made of pure gold. "But how did you do it? How did you get so fast?" McKenna holstered his gun with a flourish that drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd. "Practice, of course. Hours and hours of practice. But you want to know the real secret?" He leaned in conspiratorially. "I learned to laugh while I practiced. Makes the hand steady, keeps the mind sharp." Sheriff Riley shook his head in amazement. "I've seen some fast guns in my time, but that was something else entirely." "Fast guns are common enough out here," McKenna replied, his expression growing thoughtful. "The territories are full of young men who can draw quick and shoot straight. But speed alone isn't enough. You need to understand people. Need to read them like you'd read trail sign." He gestured toward the jail where Hawley and his men were being held. "Take today, for instance. I wasn't just faster than them. I understood them, knew how they'd react, what they'd do. That's worth more than any quick draw. The saloon owner, still tallying up the day's unusual events, called out, "But what about the laughing? Was that part of understanding them too?" McKenna's smile widened. The laugh? That's the easiest part of all. You see, when you've seen as much of life and death as I have, you learn that there are really only two choices. You can let it turn you hard and bitter, or you can learn to see the humor in it all. I chose to laugh. As night settled over Bitter Creek, the crowd in the Lucky Strike began to thin, though no one wanted to be the first to leave. McKenna's presence had transformed the saloon into something magical, a place where legend and reality danced together in the lamplight. Even Marshal Wilson, who had seen his share of famous lawmen and notorious outlaws, found himself lingering. "You know," the marshal said, studying McKenna thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about something Hawley said during processing. He claimed you'd been playing with him all along, that you could have ended it at any time." McKenna's ever-present smile took on a different quality, knowing, almost predatory. "Smart man, Jake Hawley? Smarter than most I hunt, that's probably why he survived long enough to build his reputation." He paused, spinning his empty glass. "And yes, I could have ended it quickly, but then we wouldn't be sitting here having this fascinating conversation, would we?" "So it was all for show?" Deputy Wilson asked, a hint of disapproval in his voice. "Young man," McKenna replied, his tone gentle but firm, "everything out here is for show. The quick draw contests, the dangerous reputations, the legendary feuds. It's all theater. The trick is understanding what kind of show you're putting on, and more importantly, why." The saloon owner, who had been silently wiping glasses nearby, spoke up. "But surely the danger was real enough, one wrong move and I'd be dead?" McKenna finished, chuckling. "Maybe. But here's something I learned a long time ago. A man who fears death can never truly live. And a man who can laugh in the face of death, well, that man becomes something more than just a man. He becomes a story." Outside, the night had grown cool, the earlier storm leaving behind a crisp clarity that made the stars seem close enough to touch. Through the windows, they could see townsfolk still gathered in small groups, reluctant to end this historic day. "Tell me something," Sheriff Riley said, leaning forward. "All those stories you told during the standoff, about Dodge City, about hunting other gangs, how many of them were true?" McKenna's eyes twinkled. "All of them. And none of them. Does it really matter? The stories served their purpose. They made Hawley and his men think about all the things they didn't know about me, all the possibilities they couldn't account for." He stood, stretching like a cat after a satisfying meal. "The best stories, Sheriff, are the ones that make people question what they think they know. Take today, for instance. By tomorrow, everyone in the territory will have heard about how Lightning McKenna took down the Hawley gang while laughing. Some will say I'm crazy. Others will call me fearless. But all of them will think twice before causing trouble in these parts." Marshal Wilson nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "Because they won't know which stories are true and which aren't. They won't know what to expect." "Exactly." McKenna's laugh rang out once more. "And in my line of work, uncertainty is better than any gun ever made. Fear makes men stupid, makes them predictable. But confusion? Confusion makes them cautious." As midnight approached, McKenna finally rose to leave, his movements carrying the same easy grace he'd shown during the gunfight. The remaining patrons watched him with a mixture of awe and newfound understanding. He wasn't just a skilled gunman or a clever bounty hunter, he was an artist who painted with legend and shadow. "One last question," Marshal Wilson said, following him to the door. "Where will you go next? Surely after today's work you've earned some rest." McKenna's laugh was softer now, but no less genuine. "Rest? Marshal, have you ever noticed how the most interesting stories never really end? They just flow into new beginnings." He adjusted his gun belt with practiced ease. "Besides, I heard some interesting rumors about the Carson brothers up near Dakota Territory. Seems they've been getting serious about their work lately. And that appeals to you? Sheriff Riley asked. Because they're being serious? Exactly. McKenna's eyes lit up. Men who take themselves too seriously are just begging to be taught a lesson in humility. And I do so enjoy being an educator. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another silver dollar, different from the one he'd given the boy earlier. This one was unmarked, gleaming in the lamplight. "Watch this," he said, and with a quick movement that few eyes could follow, he flipped the coin into the air. Instead of drawing his gun, however, he simply caught it and handed it to the marshal. "Keep it, consider it a reminder." Wilson turned the coin over in his hands, puzzled. "A reminder of what?" "That not every challenge needs to be met with a gun," McKenna replied, his smile knowing. "Sometimes the best shot is the one you don't take. Sometimes the real power lies in letting people wonder what you might do, rather than showing them what you can do." He stepped out onto the boardwalk, where his horse waited patiently. The animal's coat seemed to shimmer in the starlight, as if it too was part of some larger legend. As McKenna mounted up, his black duster settling around him like wings, he turned back to the assembled onlookers. "You know what the real joke is?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Every man I hunt thinks he's writing his own story, but they never realize they're actually just characters in mine." His laughter rang out one final time, echoing off the buildings of Bitter Creek. "And I do so love a good story." With that, he touched his hat brim in a casual salute and rode off into the darkness. The sound of his laughter lingered in the air, mixing with the night wind and the distant cry of coyotes. Those who witnessed his departure would later swear that even his horse's hoofbeats seemed to carry a rhythm of amusement. Back in the Lucky Strike, the saloon owner began closing up, carefully sweeping around the broken glass and bullet holes that would soon become proud markers of history. "You think we'll see him again?" he asked no one in particular. Marshal Wilson, still holding the silver dollar, smiled slightly. "I reckon we will. Men like McKenna, they're like stories themselves. They have a way of coming back around when you least expect them, but most need them." And so the legend of the laughing stranger grew, spreading across the territories like wildfire. In saloons and around campfires, people would tell tales of the bounty hunter who fought with a smile and killed with a laugh. Some said he was mad. Others called him a genius, but all agreed on one thing. In a land where death often rode hard and serious, Lightning McKenna had found a way to make justice wear a smile.